Alright, in this video, what we're going to do is actually use the historical method to prove a point about history. This will be the first video where we do that. So now we're getting into like actual, historical knowledge. We've been kind of teasing that in our previous video on the historical method, but what we're going to demonstrate in this video is that the disciples really believe that Jesus rose from the dead. They really believed it. They sincerely believed it. This is a point that enjoys the support of the consensus of historians who study this. So the experts who study this, the Christian ones, the atheist ones, the Jewish ones, everybody agrees. From the atheist end to the Christian end and everywhere in between, the liberal Christian, when it comes to actual legitimate historians who actually dedicate their lives to studying these questions, if you don't think that the apostles of Jesus really believed that he came back from the dead, you're laughed at. It's considered historically certain, which means, yes, there's a slim chance that it's not true, but you really are irrational for not accepting it. Or it has a consensus, which means like you've got like two wacko professors somewhere who like reject it, but everybody else accepts it. Because you can't ever get a world in the world of university professors, you always got that one guy. But anyway, let's get into it. Let's get into how we go about doing that. All right. The first point that we need to make is that the disciples really did claim to have witnessed the resurrection, so how do we know that the disciples claimed that? Well, Paul claimed it. He claimed that, like 2 Corinthians 1, he straight up claims that the disciples of Jesus are willing to undergo daily persecution because they are imitating Jesus himself and because God raised him from the dead. So, if you read 2 Corinthians, it's clear that Paul clearly has this whole idea that he's willing to undergo physical pain and torture because Jesus has been raised from the dead. Okay, so it's a quite clear concept in there. You also have what's called an oral tradition. And by the way, when it comes to Paul and the books that Paul wrote, there are books that some historians, like the really skeptical historians, say maybe Paul didn't write this, maybe someone pretended to be Paul and wrote this. I'm going to circumvent that debate by simply just using the uncontested books of Paul, where like the totally skeptical, critical historians still accept Paul wrote 2 Corinthians, 1 Corinthians, Romans, and every other one that we're going to use. So, just read 2 Corinthians, to see what he has to say about that. There's also oral traditions on this point. So what we have in 1 Corinthians, not 2 Corinthians, but 1 Corinthians 15, Paul preserves for us this like oral tradition. It's a creed. It's like something, through textual criticism, they can tell this is not written by Paul. This is some sort of like rhyming thing. And he says to the Corinthians, I taught you this when I was with you before. Which they would have known if, he was not going to lie to them about that. So he taught it to them before 55 AD, which is the accepted date when Paul wrote 1 Corinthians. Okay? And the accepted dates for when Jesus was crucified, like the crucifixion of Jesus is another uncontested point of history. And I won't even bother going into proving that. We can kind of prove it in the next video in sort of a backhanded way. Sort of a roundabout way. But backhanded makes it sound bad. A roundabout way. But for now, we'll just say that's uncontested for the sake of this video. Because it is. But 30 to 34 AD for Jesus's crucifixion, okay? And subsequent resurrection, okay? 55 AD for the writing of 1 Corinthians, okay? But we can establish a timeline for Paul's life based on things that Paul said and things that, he wouldn't have lied about, we can get an idea when Paul would have been in Corinth and taught them this creed, this sort of rhyming statement. And in this creed in 1 Corinthians 15, it literally, it says like, like Jesus resurrected and there were certain witnesses to the resurrection. Okay, it's straight up, that's straight up what it's about. That like, these people, Jesus appeared to, he was crucified, was buried, appeared to so-and-so, 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 so-and-so. Okay? Based on a timeline of Paul's life, he would have, when did he get that? Because he says he received it. He didn't come up with it on his own. He says he received it. Okay, well, he would have received it from these people. Okay, so like Peter and James and those guys, the apostles in Jerusalem. And he also says that he, witnessed the risen Christ with this famous story of Christ appearing to him in the sky. It's generally accepted, you're looking at maybe 3 years after the resurrection, because given that Paul was persecuting Christians right away, 15 years is how long you're looking at for, like, when Corinthians was written. But you have to push it before that, and it's like 3 years seems about right. Okay, so, like, it could be earlier, because there's certain time windows when Paul could have gone to Jerusalem and learned it from the apostles. There's certain time frames, because, like, it has to be before Galatians, and, like, we established that. Anyway, there, it says clearly that, like, they believe that Jesus appeared to them. Okay? We also have Christian sources. So there's this guy, in other words, like Christians who come after the New Testament. For example, Polycarp is this guy who was like the preacher, like the bishop, like the guy who was like running the church in Smyrna, which is this place in, I don't know where exactly. I think it's in what today would be Turkey. And like we can prove historically that Polycarp knew John, and also that Ignatius knew Polycarp. And if we look at what they have to say, I think we're going to see this later on, they straight up say it too, what Paul says in 2 Corinthians, that like the apostles witnessed Jesus back from the dead, and that was their basis for why they weren't afraid to die in their spreading of the message about Jesus. They like literally say exactly that. Okay? That's they say it for like, not verbatim in the way that I just said it, but that's exactly what they have to say. Okay? So the important point is the disciples claim to witness the resurrection, and it's connected to their willingness to die. And we can, prove that historically, based on these historical sources. Okay? But the added question is like, were they really willing to die and suffer, violent persecution? Because if they were, then that means that, like, they really believed it, right? Like, those 9/11 hijackers who flew those jumbo jetliners into the World Trade Center on September 11, 2001. You can say what you want about them, but they really believed in Islam or their specific brand. They believed what they were doing. They died for it. They believed it. Okay? Now, does that mean that it was true? No, because that's just what they've been taught to believe all their lives. But in the apostles' case, it's different because it's based on their claim to have literally witnessed the resurrection. It's not just what their parents taught them and teachers taught them and their preacher taught them growing up and what they were trained to believe. No, they said, we believe this because we saw him back from the dead. So that's why they were willing to die, because they saw Jesus killed and murdered, and then they saw him back from the dead. And he tells them to go out and preach the message. That will embolden you. Okay, so it's a very different thing. If they were really willing to die, then that means that they weren't making it up. Or as we said, they sincerely believed it. And they were in a position to know whether or not it was true. So, like, there's an atheist historian of the New Testament who studies this stuff named Gerd Ludemann. And he says it's historically certain that they really believed it. he favors the idea that they were crazy, that they had a hallucination, they were temporarily crazy. But most historians that I've seen on this, they just say, we don't know what happened. They don't favor any alternative explanation. They just say, we don't know what happened, but there's no way a resurrection happened because that's a miracle, and the miracle is the most unlikely thing possible. And we talked about that in the other video series that we did on whether or not we can really prove a miracle happened. And so there's a whole other series on that, on, you know, the probability of miracles and establishing whether or not miracles are really super improbable or not. But that's really more of a philosophical question, and one of the problems you run into is that historians are not philosophers, and you have to take your history hat off and put your philosopher hat on, and sometimes, you know, they don't want to do that. But anyway, moving forward with this, let's look at some actual evidence that the apostles were willing to undergo violent persecution and this great personal cost for what they believed in. Well, our strongest case really revolves around Peter and Paul, but if it's true for Peter and Paul, then there's a high degree of probability that it's true for other apostles of Jesus too. There is a case that can be made that it probably happened to James, the brother of Jesus. We won't look at that for the sake of this video, because we don't want this video to be any longer than necessary. But 1 Peter just flat out is addressed to Christians who are suffering violent persecution. And again, he wouldn't lie to them about something like that. They would have known if it was true or not. So therefore, they really were being violently persecuted. And it's not like this is a big question. There's evidence galore that Christians were violently persecuted. Even the Roman historian Tacitus claims that Nero violently persecuted Christians. We've got written documents, you know, throughout the history of pagan Rome claiming this, you know. And the bottom line is, Jesus was executed, right? So they're not too crazy that his followers would be persecuted. In fact, the Romans persecuted a lot of religious groups. They didn't like groups in general. They persecuted the followers of Isis, which was around the same time, followers of Dionysus or Bacchus, because they didn't like people having groups, because that threatened violence. And it's like, well, I think something like a huge percentage of Roman emperors, like over half or something, I forget the number, were the reason what got them out of office as emperor was assassination. And so they were rationally justified in fearing political movements, and they saw every group, religious or, you know, whatever it was, they were like, probably political and they're probably going to kill me, you know. So that was always a thing. So it's not crazy at all, you know. And furthermore, Peter wouldn't lie to them about that, okay? And it raises serious questions like maybe Peter was, you know, in the same boat with them. First Clement is this letter that was written, by this guy Clement from Rome. So he writes it from Rome, and he writes it to the church in Corinth. And it's written, the dates are 64 to 96 AD, so it's like really old. As old as books of the Bible. Okay? And it's this letter to the church in Corinth. 64 AD would just be like 10 years after like 1 Corinthians. But anyway, he's writing to the church in Corinth because they have booted some of their people that were running the church, who were good people, and evil people, you know, are now running the church, and he's not happy about it, and he's saying, you know, you need to stop being jealous of other people. He goes on and on about jealousy. He goes on and on about, you know, avoiding temptation and sin, and he goes on and on about humility. And he has like examples galore. Almost all of them are from the Old Testament, but he has a few from recent times. He says from recent times, and he says literally that Peter and Paul suffered martyrdom, and they represent an example. Instead of wanting to take power for yourself, you should be willing to die for Christ. So martyrdom is a loaded word that has a meaning. Like when they say martyr, comes from this Greek word martus that means witness. So when someone, we're talking about somebody that literally died for their witness. So he's literally saying that. So what we have here now is a literal source that is claiming Peter and Paul died for their witness. Okay. So you have to say, all right, well, that's attestation. Well, do we take it as leaning the scale of probability towards it happening? Well, you have to make an assessment about whether or not he was motivated to lie about that. It's a bit of a tough call because you got to make an assessment of his point of view. He's really writing to them about something else, and so he kind of mentions it as an aside. So I would say that it's more probable. The likelihood has swung towards Peter and Paul were martyred, and then you've got other apostles probably were martyred. Given the situation, given that Jesus was executed. But we can go on. We can go on. We can make the case stronger with heavier, weightier evidence than just First Clement. But he's saying it, that lays it down there for us. It's claimed. Okay. So the issue is it's not just the fact that they died for their faith, but that they faced death on a regular basis. So 1 Thessalonians in chapter 2 and then in chapter 3, Paul straight up claims that the Thessalonian church suffered violent persecution. He compares to the persecution that happened back in Israel to the church there. He also claims to have been teaching them at the time. So in that situation, even if Paul himself wasn't persecuted, he should have been afraid of it. But then in chapter 3, he claims they knew he and his team were persecuted violently too. And in fact, the entire purpose of the letter of 1 Thessalonians is just to address this question about Christians who have died and they're worried about whether or not they're going to go to heaven because they had this idea that Jesus is going to come back and take us all with him. And some people died and they were like, what about those people? And so he settles that and explains all of that for them. And that's what he writes to them about in 1 Thessalonians. But that's the whole point, is about Christians dying. That's the whole context of 1 Thessalonians. Christians are dying. What happens to them? Okay? And he talks about how they went through it. He went through it. His team. So, again, he wouldn't write to them about that and lie about that, given that they knew. They full well knew. Because he's saying, he literally says, y'all know, I was there with you. Okay, so you're not going to lie about that, right? Okay, so it becomes very improbable that it's not true. Okay, but we can go on further. Paul also writes the letter to the Philippians. And the letter to the Philippians is like this thank you note to the Philippians. Paul's in jail, and in Roman jails, you had to literally support yourself financially in food and clothes and everything. Okay, and most jail was only for rich people anyway, and we talked about that in the previous video, so I'm not going to go into it again. But if you want to hear more about that, it's in the video series on historical method. But if you were poor, they just killed you without a trial. He sends the letter back to them, saying, "Thank you, I don't need any more. Thank you for your support. I'm good." Okay, so there's a guy. I forget the name of the guy that's mentioned in the letter as the guy that brought them the money, and he sends the letter back to the Philippians. Okay, well, that guy would have known if Paul was actually in jail. So if he wasn't in jail, this thank you note about, thank you for the money, but I don't need any more. This letter to the Philippians, they would have been, it wouldn't have bof this sacred letter of the Bible if that guy came back saying, "Hey, y'all, Paul wasn't even in jail." Okay? It wouldn't have been preserved. All of these ancient documents exist for us today because people recopied them as the paper rotted. Okay? But on top of that, Polycarp, who is in a position to have known the apostles, he wrote to the Philippians a letter. He's the leader of the church in Smyrna, and it's known that he would have known John and stuff, and would have known the apostles. In 130 A.D., he states to them that they venerated their letter, that letter was venerated. So that letter wouldn't have been venerated if it was all just a thank you note about him being in jail that turned out to be a lie. So he was really in jail. Okay. All right. But there's more.